Hi, I'm Patrick Scott. Welcome back to PLS 101, American Democracy and Citizenship. We're going to continue and finish up our discussion today on Congress, and I'm going to be talking particularly about term limits, the pros and cons, some arguments for and against term limits. We'll also be discussing some information about the Missouri's legislature too. So we'll be talking about not only Congress at the federal level, but also at the state level. Now, before I even start talking about that, one of the points that we didn't get around to in our last session that I wanted to point out here was that some scholars have looked at Congress and they say a persistent problem with Congress is this notion of collective irresponsibility. That's a function of individual responsiveness. In other words, what they're suggesting here is that individual responsiveness leads to collective irresponsibility. Well, I know that doesn't really clarify what I'm trying to say here, so let me elaborate here. When I say individual responsiveness, what I'm suggesting here is the level of responsiveness that members of Congress have to their constituency. All right? We talked about the idea of that delegate role in a couple sessions ago about Congress having either a delegate role versus a trustee role, and more members of the House tend to embody that delegate role, while the Senate tends to embody more of the trustee role. And the delegate role is essentially a direct link between the member or the representative and the constituency. And the idea, of course, is that the representative should really follow very, very clearly and closely what the wishes of the constituency is. And so the argument here is that as a member of Congress, if you are being individually responsive to your district, to your members of to your constituency, that is a good thing. Now, what are the kinds of things does it mean to be individually responsive? You are helping your constituents. Now, what's one of the best ways to help your constituents? Is bringing federal dollars back home to your district, right? Bringing home the bacon by introducing provisions in bills that, like for example, a transportation authorization bill, a highway bill of some sort, that contains a lot of money to help benefit the highways and improve the highways in my district. That would be a very good example of how I'm bringing home the bacon. By helping to increase the funding for example, creating a Veterans Administration hospital, say in Springfield. Springfield doesn't have a VA hospital. And if I am able to insert a provision in a bill that allows for the creation of a VA hospital in my district, that would obviously please a lot of my constituents. So other kinds of ways that will allow me to bring money. If, for example, we have a large company like General Electric, and if I'm able to insert provisions in the bill that will increase funding for General Electric, and let's say in my particular district that they're building or overseeing and playing a role in a contract for some type of computer components for a submarine, a new generation of submarines, and they're involved. GE may be involved in some type of computer-related components that go into that new generation of nuclear submarines. And if they're being provided for and built in my district, and I'm bringing the money to help increase the funding and increase the contracts, or more contracts with expanded capabilities that General Electric benefits from, that bring additional jobs into my district, I'm bringing home the bacon. Okay, so the point here is all this, is as follows. Those are great examples of how I'm being, as a member of Congress, individually responsive as an individual member of Congress. But the concern here, the more responsive I am to my district, to my constituents, what does that say collectively about the body of Congress or the institution of Congress as a whole? And that's where the term comes in. Individual responsiveness leads to collective irresponsibility. If I am trying to play that game of bringing home the bacon, you multiply that 435 times across all the congressional districts across the United States, and we're all doing that because we know that that helps us to get reelected. In the process of doing so, might one wonder if we're spending too much money? Does individual responsiveness lead to collective irresponsibility? That's kind of the argument behind that. They're suggesting that that is indeed what happens, is that as each member of Congress does a great job in bringing home the bacon, collectively we're spending way too much money than we should be in terms of this. In other words, what might be good for my district may not be good for America as a whole, because it may actually lead to deficit spending, increased taxes, and those kinds of things. So while you as a member of my district appreciate what I'm doing in terms of bringing dollars for research or shoring up highways and those kinds of things for the district, or for education, those can be great things, but collectively it may actually lead to more deficit spending. It may actually hurt our budget because of that. I'm reminded of, for example, of a project in Alaska about I think a highway or a bridge that's being built to connect residents of one particular island in Alaska. I think they have 56 members of that who live on that island. And I don't remember all the specifics here, but the idea is that this amount of money that's being appropriated for the public work infrastructure in that area amounts to something like $90,000 per constituent. And that's a lot of money to benefit that few constituents, and the question is that money being appropriately spent? What is individually responsive might be perceived by others as collectively irresponsible. And again, you might look at it this way. One person's treasured type of pork barrel project might be somebody else's waste. Okay, wasteful spending, example of wasteful spending. You know, we talk about, for example, the idea of researchers providing federal dollars for researchers to study the environment. And maybe some of those dollars might actually go into looking at methane production in the atmosphere. Methane is bad. Well, one of the significant contributors to methane production is cow flatulence. So now you're thinking about all these dollars that are being spent to study cow flatulence. You're thinking, well, wait a second, is that really appropriate money being spent? We're researching cow flatulence? Well, researching the environment and air pollution is important, right? And that sounds reasonable, but when we start looking at this in terms of cow flatulence, we might not think that that's necessarily a good thing. But to the farmer, or to maybe the research scientist, I should say, perhaps, and the research operation that's looking at this, that might be, and you happen to be a member of this research consortium, then you may actually find this to be a very, very legitimate form of spending. But what I may think of as being legitimate, you maybe think of as illegitimate forms of spending. So that's what I'm just suggesting here to you. On the one hand, individual responsiveness can lead to collective irresponsibility. We may be spending more money than we need, having bigger government than we really need, because of the dynamics that influence individual members of Congress. And again, what I may see as being a legitimate kind of project for which these dollars are being allocated, you might see as being illegitimate waste of taxpayer money. Okay, a lot of it's in the eye of the beholder. But excuse me. But the point here is then, I just want you to understand the dynamics that shape this idea of the trustee role in Congress to help please your constituents, to get reelected, to show that you're doing a good job, in a lot of ways potentially can lead to this notion of collective irresponsibility, of more government than we need, and potentially wasteful government spending, at least in the eyes of many people. So what is individually rational, you might say, can be collectively irrational. All right, now I'm going to shift and start talking now about the idea of term limits, talking about reform of Congress. And one of the talks in the discussions about reform of Congress is this notion of term limits. Should we have term limits? Is this a good idea whose time has come? Because after all, we know that some people stay in Congress for many, many years. There are no term limits in Congress, and so consequently, some people serve for long, long periods of time. Consequently, you might wonder whether or not this is good for our democracy. Now, historically, the most common proposal to limit membership of the House and the Senate has been 12 years. So you think for the House membership, that would be 6 terms. 6 times 2 is 12. And members of the Senate to 2 terms, 2 6-year terms, but 12 years in both cases. That's been the most common proposal in terms of enacting term limits. Interestingly, in up to early 1990s, 14 states had adopted term limits, including Missouri. And Missouri adopted term limits in 1992. Now, in 1995, the Supreme Court struck down term limits on Congress in a famous court case called U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton. In that court case, the court ruled that states could not pass laws that limit the terms of members of Congress. All right, now, so what that now means is that to impose term limits would require amending the Constitution, okay? Because basically it said that states could not pass laws to do this. In other words, to allow states to do this, you have to amend the Constitution. And of course, we know how hard it is to amend the Constitution back from our earlier discussions. Now, I want to ask you this. Why do you think that the Supreme Court said that states did not have the right to basically tell members of Congress how long they could serve? All right. In other words, why was it that Missouri could no longer say how long we could do this? Think about this. In Missouri, our legislators in Jefferson City were telling our legislators in the U.S. Congress how long they could serve. What's the problem there? What does that do? What does that tantamount to doing? As you may imagine, what that does is that it's elevating state governments over the federal government. All right, and again, it kind of harkens back to McCulloch versus Maryland, our discussion on federalism, and also in the Constitution as well. But the point here is that the Supreme Court struck down state-imposed term limits on Congress because it elevated the states over the federal government. It was state legislators telling federal personnel, people that we elect to serve in the federal government, what they could or could not do, and that's why they were considered unconstitutional. All right, because it does. The reasoning again is that it elevates the states over the federal government. Now, that's not to say, and I make sure you understand this, states can pass laws that limit term limits of state legislators. In other words, people in Jeff City can pass a law that limits the terms to people in Jeff City, and we have that right now. And that was actually upheld in a recent Supreme Court case too. But states can pass a law that limit terms of state legislators, but not the terms of federal legislators. For that to change at this point would require an amendment to the Constitution. Nonetheless, let's talk about this in terms of some pros and cons about term limits. You know, what are some of the arguments for term limits, and what are the arguments against term limits? Let me also say at the outset too how I like to tie different points from other discussions together. If you believe in term limits, you are probably adopting a Jeffersonian view of governance, all right? And if you happen to be opposed to term limits, you are adopting more of a Hamiltonian view of governance. And we'll talk about that, and as we do, hopefully you'll see these perspectives coming out. But specific arguments for term limits. Why do we want term limits? Term limits are good because, as one argument goes, you become out of touch with the people. Okay, so the idea here is that you become a career politician, and you need to have term limits because you got to have new blood that comes in, and that more really reflects the will of the people. Being a career politician basically means you become out of touch with the people. Now, I question that particular argument, as you might imagine, because first of all, do you remember the idea of the Tuesday to Thursday club that we call members of Congress, and particularly members of the House of Representatives? What are they doing from Friday through the following Monday? They are often back at home at their districts. You remember the advantages of incumbency, the various advantages, and one of those advantages was all these free trips back home to their district. Okay, so if they're always going back home to their district, if they're always out of Washington largely from Friday through Monday, then I'm not so sure how relevant that argument is that members of Congress are out of touch with the people. In a lot of ways, I think members of Congress get reelected over and over again because they are in touch with their constituents. They're making their constituents happy, they know what makes them happy, and they're doing the things that make them happy to help to get them reelected. So in that regard, the argument that you become out of touch with the people, I'm not so sure is a very, very strong argument. Okay? But nonetheless, that's one of the classic arguments proposed for term limits. You need to have term limits because you need to get rid of the career politicians, because these career politicians have really become out of touch with the people. Okay. Interestingly, I also say this, some research has even looked at differences between senior members of Congress and junior members of Congress, and looked at the difference, the long timers versus the short timers, and they have found out that the senior members of Congress provide just about as much of attention to their districts back home as junior members do. All right? So even those who are going to get reelected over and over and over again, you think that they don't have to worry about jumping through all those hoops to keep their constituents happy as much, but they really do provide just about as much attention to their districts back home as the junior members do, the ones who just came in. Okay, so anyway, that's one argument for term limits. Now, let me give you a better argument for term limits. And this relates back to the idea of incumbency. Incumbency is such a powerful phenomenon that it deprives voters of a real opportunity for choice. The choice that you basically have tends to be limited to very wealthy individuals who can afford to spend big dollars to try to defeat the incumbent. All right? So again, incumbency is so powerful that it really deprives voters of a real opportunity for choice. Because incumbents are going to get reelected over and over again. Is that a real choice that you have, knowing that they have all these advantages? And the choice that you do have, the challenger, basically to overcome all those advantages of incumbency, you've got to have a lot of money to raise, or be able to raise, or have a lot of money in your own pocket to be able to offset those natural advantages of the incumbent. We were talking about some of this in terms of campaign finance and campaign finance reform. And we said back then that if you try to limit the amount of money that's being spent by challengers, then that automatically confers an advantage on incumbent, because incumbency is very, very powerful. So the argument here is that, well, if you have term limits, then that helps to moderate or reduce that natural advantage that incumbents have. All right, now that kind of makes sense. And some people along those same lines, a corollary to that, have said that term limits is good because it helps bring more of the common person, if you will, into the arena. More women, more minorities, more people from all walks of life can be brought into politics because it fosters greater competition. All right? And so term limits would be good because it would allow more people to run for office, and also, by the way, it might, as a natural byproduct, help reduce campaign expenditures too. Okay? If you didn't have to worry about incumbency all the time. Now, a third point, an argument, and by the way, that second argument I think has some merit to it. Now, more so than the first argument. A third argument is this, and that is term limits are good because it allows you to vote your conscience. If you're a member of Congress, it allows you to vote your Congress. You can vote how you really feel about things rather than trying to please people. You don't have to hold your finger up to see which way the political winds are blowing to see how you should vote about things. The argument here is that the desire to get reelected means that you're more concerned about pleasing the lobbyists, pleasing the PACs, than doing the right thing. So this allows you, by having term limits, by not having to worry about PAC dollars or offending political action committees or interest groups down the road, by not having to worry about that because you're going to be out of office anyway, you can vote on how you truly believe on things, and that's a good thing. So knowing that you cannot be reelected, and that you don't have to worry about reelection, then you don't have to worry about raising campaign money. So therefore, you can spend your time thinking about and voting on what you think is right, and then do what simply an interest group may want you to do. All right. So that's the argument about the third argument about term limits, because it allows you to really devote your conscience, since you don't have to worry about getting reelected. Now, let me share with you some arguments against. The arguments for tend to reflect a Jeffersonian model. The argument against tends to reflect more of a Hamiltonian model of governance. First of all, some people say term limits are bad or unnecessary because they deprive voters of the opportunity to re-elect good people. Voters are the ones who are the best judge of who should stay in office. They should have the right to re-elect their own representatives and senators if they wish. As somebody quoted one time, we already have term limits. They are called elections. So the argument here is that if people are not doing a good job, then vote them out. If they are doing a good job, then you ought to keep them in, and you ought to have the right to keep them in. If you saw how they've benefited, they're a wise legislator. They're making good decisions. They're playing a very important role in helping our country as a whole, but also your district in particular. Why would you not have the right to be able to re-elect them and vote them back in? If they're doing a good job, you want to have Congress made of good people who are doing their job in a good way. Why not? So the argument here is that they deprive voters of the opportunity to re-elect good people, and voters ought to have the right they are the best judge of who should be in office or who should be re-elected. Let me give you another argument, and I think this is actually a fairly compelling argument here too, and that is if you enact term limits, you've got to think about this in terms of the balance of power. And you think about Congress as an institution. And as Congress is an institution, think about the bureaucracy as an institution that carries out laws and implements laws through rules and regulations, and think about the presidency as well. And in a lot of ways, if you enact term limits for Congress, you're going to basically shift that balance of power. You're going to be weakening Congress as an institution. You'll be strengthening the presidency as an institution. You'll be strengthening the bureaucracy as an institution. And you'll, to some degree, be strengthening the hand and role of interest groups. So, because here's what's happening. If you have term limits, you are depriving Congress of institutional knowledge and expertise. That member of Congress who spent years learning defense policy, like Senator Sam Nunn, who became an expert on defense by years sitting on the Senate Armed Services Committee, which oversaw the Pentagon defense programs and budget from year to year. If you don't have that expertise and they're term limited out, guess what? Then you're basically going to be giving the prerogative of making good decisions over to the Pentagon, over to the presidency, and then over to interest groups that maybe want to influence our defense weapons as an example of that. Okay? So in other words, taking out good, experienced legislators would tilt the balance of power to these other entities. Along the same lines, you can put this as a separate point, but point B and point C kind of go together. Not only do you deprive Congress of institutional knowledge and expertise and thereby shift the balance of power, but a corollary to that, this is being point C, is that amateurs would be coming in that'd be always learning the ropes and wondering if that makes for good policy. You see, the short-termers will have a hard time mastering the intricacies of federal policies and politics, so they will become dependent upon, again, interest groups, maybe unelected staff, maybe Washington lobbyists, and again, other people, like I mentioned before, such as in the bureaucracy and the executive branch. So the argument here is that the amateurs, you'd be bringing in amateurs instead of experts, and they'll always be kind of learning the ropes. By the time they've figured out how it all works and what works good and what doesn't work well and those kinds of things, they're out. And then you also kind of wonder, will they be making good policy in the process if they're newcomers? So those who haven't had a lot of experience in defense policy, do we really want people in Congress who are newbies, who don't know anything about defense policy, making decisions about defense policy? So that's the argument behind this. All right, amateurs would always be learning the ropes, thus making for poor policy. And as one scholar has noted, senior members are much more active in the legislative process. They are much more specialized in their knowledge, and they are much likely, this is interesting too, they are much more likely to have their bills become laws than junior members of Congress. There's a lot of research that's looked at the difference between senior members versus junior members. Senior members are much more, if you will, efficient at the legislative process than junior members. Okay? So there is clearly a value to increased legislative experience. All right? Not only in terms of preserving the balance of power with Congress as an institution, but also in terms of making sure the quality of decisions that come out of Congress are good decisions because they're made by people who've been there for a while, who know how to, not only how the process works, but also the substantive components of laws that create, that enact federal policies. Now, let me give you a fourth argument here, and that is, this is a relative thing. If we allow states to enact term limits, so some states decide to have term limits and other states don't have term limits, okay, for the members of Congress, what is that going to mean in terms of the states that do put in term limits? It seems to me if Missouri were to allow to require term limits and Kansas did not, would that not potentially put Missouri at a disadvantage relative to Kansas or other nearby states that did not require term limits? Because we're the ones who would then be electing the amateurs while they've got the experts that are being reelected every 2 years. And so because of that, might that put the state of Missouri at a disadvantage relative to the other states that don't have term limits? See, because then they've got the experienced legislators who are bringing money to their district, who are benefiting their states, while we in Missouri, having the amateurs, are not as effective in being able to do so. So because of that, would that not put us at a disadvantage in terms of the flow of money to our state? Would the Missouri representatives be amateurs while other representatives could stay longer, become more powerful because they don't have term limits? So again, those are some arguments both for and against, and I want you to understand that term limits represent a bit of a Jeffersonian or anti-federalist view. And a lot of the arguments about term limits, whether you're for or against, are based upon whether you favor a representative or a direct democracy in a lot of ways. Okay, in other words, do you want representing you a professional legislator or an amateur doing the job in a lot of ways, you see? So those are some arguments here, I think, that both for and against term limits, and I think it's important for you to understand, those arguments, and then see how they harken back to that Federalist versus Federalist or Hamiltonian versus anti-Federalist or Jeffersonian views. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about is the Missouri legislature. Since we're talking about Congress, we need to also talk about the Missouri legislature. So let me spend a few minutes to talk about that. Now, first of all, Missouri has not a Congress, but we call our Missouri legislature in Jeff City the General Assembly. Now, like the U.S. Congress, we have a two-body house, a bicameral legislature. We name them the very same. We have a House and we have a Senate, as you know, in Jeff City. In terms of size, we have 163 members of the House and 34 members of the Senate. All right? Now, our term limits are a little bit different compared to at the federal counterparts. Like the U.S. House of Representatives, the Missouri House of Representatives also serve 2-year terms. But unlike the U.S. Senate, the Missouri Senate serves only for 4 years. They serve 4-year terms. All right? Now, as I mentioned about term limits, in 1992, we amended our Constitution that imposed term limits. So now anyone elected to the Missouri House or the Missouri Senate can stay only 8 years. Now, if you're in the House for 8 years, once you have met that time limit, you have to step down. You can then run for office in the Senate and serve in the Senate for 8 years. Okay, but only 8 years. 16 years total if you're able to serve in both houses, but only 8 years per house. Now, like the U.S. Congress, in terms of how districts are apportioned all across the United States based upon the census, well, in Missouri, every 10 years, we will redraw our district. Within Missouri, our districts are redrawn in Missouri to reflect population changes in the state of Missouri. Okay, so now, what has happened in recent years? Have we seen a population shift? And the answer is yes. Many years ago, a lot of the political strength in terms of the districts that had the most representatives, the concentration of political power tend to be attached to the cities, particularly St. Louis and Kansas City. What we've seen over the past 34 years, a a movement away from the inner city out to the suburbs of Kansas City and St. Louis, as also Southwest. So, for example, Christian County, Greene County, Southwest Missouri has also grown quite considerably over the past 30 years or so. All right, so these population shifts mean that there are fewer legislators, say from the inner city of Kansas City or St. Louis, and more representatives who represent the suburbs of those areas as well as Southwest Missouri. Okay, so you've seen how these shifts have altered a little bit of the political landscape. That's also had an implication in terms of political party control and strength too. For years, the Democratic Party was very, very strong in Missouri, but there's been a shift where, I'll just tell you, for years, the Democratic Party has held the majority of seats in both houses, but that has changed, and so we have seen a lot of Republican strength and a lot of Republican that's reflected because of growing, Republican concentration in the suburbs as well as in the rural areas of Missouri and also Southwest Missouri. Now, like Congress, there are many more bills that are introduced that get passed. In fact, only a very, very small fraction of bills make it into law. And one of the things about Missouri is that any bill that would cost, has a financial implication of over $100,000, has to be sent to a budget committee. And so the committee will conduct a public hearing on the bill and the issues. And what's interesting about this is that it's kind of, people can actually play some little political games here. If you happen to be a member of the House and you don't like a particular bill being considered, you may attempt to increase the cost of that bill to go over that $100,000 threshold mark, because if you do that, it increases the visibility of that bill. It also bogs it down in these additional hearings and considerations, and it also therefore increases the probability that it won't even get enacted. Okay, so I've seen instances where they've done that. They've engaged in that kind of behavior. Now, like the U.S. Congress, the Missouri legislature also has, standing committees, conference committees, things like that. They also have the power to override the veto of a governor, but veto overrides are quite rare. In other words, when the governor decides to veto something, the veto power is very, very strong, just like the president's veto power is very strong, that we've talked about in our last session. Unlike the U.S. level, at the federal level, in Missouri, the governor has the power of the line item veto, and this is almost a necessity because of the requirement for the state to balance the budget. And the Missouri governor uses the line item veto extensively on appropriations bills. All right. I know we haven't talked about the line item veto yet. We'll talk about it when we discuss the presidency in more detail. But very briefly, the line item veto essentially is when a bill reaches the governor's desk and the governor does not have to veto the whole thing. The president, by contrast, has to veto the whole thing, either sign it or veto it, up or down. But the Missouri governor can take provisions of the bill, certain portions, that maybe have certain, if you will, line items that have certain programs that are in that bill or certain costs associated with those programs, and basically say, we're not going to fund this program, or we're not going to fund these particular aspects of this program. And so that's the line item veto. And the governor therefore has the power, he's had the power for some time, to use the line item veto, and again, largely because of the fiscal responsibilities that Missouri balance its budget. And so the president doesn't have that. At one time, the president of the United States did have that power. We'll talk about that later. But unlike the president, the Missouri governor does have that power of the line item veto. Now, line item vetoes, of course, at the same time, I should point out, like regular bills, vetoes, vetoes can be overridden by the legislature, and the line item veto can also be overridden too by a two-thirds vote in both houses. So, anyway, this is probably a good time to talk to finish up our discussion about Congress and the Missouri legislature as a whole. In our next session, we are going to talk about the presidency, the institution of the presidency. We'll talk about, of course, the Missouri counterpart to that too, the role of the governor, and the powers of the presidency, and particularly and how effective is the presidency as an institution. So until then, this is Patrick Scott. We'll see you next time.